I organized 40 Muslim men to form a human wall across the entrance of a Christian church on a Sunday morning so that not a single worshipper could enter. And I stood at the center of that wall with my arms locked with the men beside me, daring any Christian to try to pass through us. But when an elderly woman carrying a Bible walked straight toward me and did the one thing none of us expected, something happened that brought the entire wall of men to the ground and left 40 grown men weeping in a church parking lot. Have you ever been so sure that you were standing on the right side of a line that you never once imagined God Himself might be standing on the other? My name is Nabil Yasser Al-Hamadi. I am 30 years old, and on September 11th, 2022, I led 40 men from our local mosque to block the entrance of St. Matthew's Anglican Church in Bradford, England, forming a human chain across the front doors so that no one could enter for Sunday worship. I had no idea that what happened that morning in a church parking lot would destroy everything I believed about God, about power, and about who was truly being held captive: the Christians we were blocking or the men standing in the chain. I grew up in the Manningham district of Bradford, in a terraced house on a street where every family was Pakistani Muslim, and the call to prayer from the Manningham Lane Mosque echoed off the stone walls every morning before sunrise. My father, Yasser Qadir Al-Hamadi, was a community elder who had emigrated from Mirpur in Pakistani-administered Kashmir in the 1980s. He ran a textile importing business and served as a voluntary imam on Fridays. My mother, Nabil, wore full hijab and taught Quran to neighborhood girls in our front room every Saturday. The house always smelled of lamb karahi and fresh roti mixed with utter perfume she dabbed on before prayers. Islam was not just our religion, it was the street we lived on, the language we spoke at home, the walls around everything we knew. While other boys in Manningham spent afternoons playing cricket in the park or gaming on PlayStations, I sat on the mosque floor studying Tajweed under Sheikh Irfan. By 14, I had memorized the entire Quran. The elders said, "Allah has blessed your parents with a special son." I never missed a single prayer, not even when bronchitis had me coughing through every rakah or snow made the streets impassable. During Ramadan, I fasted without complaint and added voluntary fasts on Mondays and Thursdays. My devotion came from a place so deep it felt like my own heartbeat. But alongside devotion grew something harder. My father taught me that Christianity was a corruption of God's truth brought by British colonizers. He said every church in Bradford was a monument to the lie that a man could be God. He told me Christians practice shirk, the unforgivable sin. By 17, I had joined a youth group dedicated to protecting our community from the Christian threat. We leafleted outside churches, organized petitions against building permits, and stood on corners during Sunday mornings counting which Muslims entered Christian buildings. I believed every act was service to Allah. By 28, I had completed my degree in accounting from the University of Bradford and was working at a mid-sized firm in the city center. I was engaged to a devout woman named Sana, whose father was head of the mosque's education committee. I had a career, a respected name, a fiancé who shared my faith, and the trust of every elder in our community. I had everything. I had no idea that everything I believed was about to be shattered in the most public and humiliating way I could imagine. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever built your entire life on something you were completely sure would never break? Everything started because of a rumor. Word spread that St. Matthew's Anglican Church, 4 streets from our mosque, had begun an outreach program targeting young Muslims, offering free English tutoring and meals with the hidden purpose of converting teenagers. The thought made me sick with rage. I brought the issue to Sheikh Irfan. He said, They are fishing in our waters. Someone must show them our community will not be silent. I proposed the blockade that evening. Sheikh Irfan approved. My father placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "You are doing what is right." I had no idea that the Jesus whose church I planned to shut down was preparing to open a door inside me that no human chain could ever block. Recruiting 40 men took less than a week. Tariq was my right-hand man, a postgraduate student in Islamic studies. Imran was a taxi driver whose teenage daughter had been invited to a church youth event. Bilal was a warehouse worker, broad and tall, whose presence alone could make people change direction. Asif was my cousin, loyal to a fault. And 36 other men, from university students to retired shopkeepers, all believed we were defending our faith. Tariq scouted St. Matthew's the previous Sunday and reported that the main entrance had double wooden doors with a short path from the pavement. The morning service began at 10:30. Our plan was simple. Arrive at 9:45, form a chain across the entrance before any worshippers, and stand in silence until service time passed. No shouting, no signs, just 40 Muslim men standing as a living wall. The night before, I prayed tahajjud at 3 in the morning in my bedroom with the curtains drawn against the orange street light outside. I asked Allah for strength and unity. But as I pressed my forehead to the carpet, I felt something I could not explain, a heaviness on my chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with nerves, like a hand pressing down on my ribs. I opened my eyes and looked around the dark room. Nothing. I told myself it was Shaitan trying to weaken my courage. I barely slept. Have you ever been so convinced you were defending truth that you never stopped to question whether the God of truth was actually on your side of the line? We arrived at St. Matthew's at 9:40 on a grey September morning. The sky was overcast and the air smelled of damp stone and car exhaust. The church was a Victorian building of dark brick with a square tower and tall arched windows filled with stained glass that looked black from the outside. The wooden doors were painted red. A small notice board beside them read, "All are welcome in this house." 40 men formed a chain across the entrance. We locked arms. Tariq stood to my left, Bilal to my right. Imran, Asif and the others stretched across the full width of the path and spilled onto the pavement on either side. We were an unbroken wall. We stood in silence. The first worshippers began arriving at 10:10. An elderly couple approached slowly, the man holding the woman's arm. They stopped when they saw us. Confusion crossed their faces, then understanding. They turned around and walked back to their car. A family with 3 young children came next. The mother looked at the wall of men and quietly led her children away without a word. 2 teenage girls approached, saw the line, and left. One by one, Christians who had come to worship on a Sunday morning were turned away by the silent barrier we had formed. None of them argued, none of them shouted, they simply left. And with every person who turned around, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Our message was being received. Our community was making its stand. By 10:20, perhaps 15 or 20 people had been turned away. Then I saw her, an elderly woman walking alone up the pavement toward the church. She was small, barely 5 feet tall. Her white hair was pinned beneath a gray scarf. She wore a long navy coat and carried a worn leather Bible in both hands like it was the most precious thing she owned. She walked slowly, deliberately. She did not stop when she saw the chain. She did not turn around. She walked directly toward me, toward the center of the wall. She stopped less than a meter from my chest and looked up at me. Her eyes were blue and clear and filled with something I had never seen directed at me from a stranger. Complete calm. She said, "Good morning, dear. I have come to worship my Lord. "Will you let me pass?" I said nothing. Bilal tightened his arm against mine. The line held. The old woman nodded slowly, and then she did the thing that none of us were prepared for. She knelt down, right there on the wet pavement. She placed her Bible on the ground in front of her. She folded her hands, and she began to pray, out loud. "Lord Jesus," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I cannot enter your house this morning, but I will worship you here. And I pray for these young men standing before me. They do not know you yet, but you know them. You know their names. You love them. Open their eyes, Lord. Let them see you the way I see you." She was not angry. She was not crying. She was praying for us with the same tone a grandmother uses to pray for her own grandchildren at bedtime. Her peace made me furious. I wanted her to be afraid. I wanted her to argue or cry or curse. Her calm was worse than any resistance could have been. An old woman kneeling on wet concrete was doing more damage to my certainty than an army could have done. Other Christians who had been turned away began to come back. They saw the old woman and they knelt too. On the pavement, on the grass beside the path, one by one, families, teenagers, the elderly couple who had been the first to leave returned and knelt on the curb. Within minutes, perhaps 25 Christians were kneeling in a semicircle in front of our chain, praying for us, not against us, for us. The sight was so disarming that I felt the arms on either side of me begin to tremble. The old woman looked up at me again and said, "Jesus loves you, son. He died for your sins just as he died for mine. And this door you are blocking is not mine, it is his. And he does not need a door to reach you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to break the line and walk away. Instead, I tightened my arms and shouted at the men to hold. That is when it happened. The moment that changed everything I believed about God. The old woman closed her eyes and whispered one more prayer. I could not hear the words, but the moment she finished, something changed in the air itself. I felt it in my chest first. Warmth. Not temperature warmth, living warmth. Like something with a heartbeat was pressing against my ribs from the inside. It spread through my arms, into my locked hands, into my fingers. My grip loosened. Not because I chose to let go, because my hands would not obey me. Then the light came. It did not come from the sky. The morning was still gray and overcast. It came from everywhere. A golden radiance that had no source and no shadow. It settled over the parking lot like mist. I could feel it on my skin. I could feel it in my lungs with every breath. And standing behind the kneeling old woman, between her and the red church doors, I saw him. Jesus. He was not a painting, not a vision in the clouds. He was standing there with the solidity of a man, but the radiance of something that had never been born and would never die. His robe was white. His eyes held the entire history of my life in a single glance. There was no anger. There was a sadness so deep it made me ashamed to breathe, and behind the sadness, a love so enormous that it crushed every wall I had ever built. He looked at me and spoke without moving his lips. The words entered my chest like electricity. "You built a wall to keep my people out, but I have never needed a door to enter a heart. The wall you built this morning was never between them and me. It was between you and me, and I have come to tear it down." My knees buckled. I collapsed onto the wet pavement. My arms ripped free from the chain. Tears poured down my face faster than I could understand why they were falling. I was crying harder than I had ever cried in my life. The chain shattered. Man after man fell. Tariq dropped to his knees and covered his face with both hands, shaking. Bilal, the biggest and strongest of us, was sitting on the ground with his back against the church wall, weeping like a child. Imran was on all fours with his forehead touching the wet concrete. Asif had stumbled backward and was leaning against a parked car, tears streaming silently into his beard. Of the 40 men, at least 30 were on the ground. The rest had fled down the street. The golden light faded slowly, like dawn in reverse. The old woman was still kneeling. She had not moved. She opened her eyes, looked at me lying on the pavement, and smiled. She reached out and placed her hand on the top of my head, the way my own grandmother used to do. She said, "He loves you, son. He has been waiting for you your whole life. Do you understand now?" I had no idea that the door I tried to block would become the door I walked through. Ask yourself this question. How do you explain the living God tearing down a wall you built with 40 men when everything you believed told you he had no power? The old woman's name was Margaret. She helped me to my feet. She took my hand and walked me through the red doors of St. Matthew's. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and candle wax. Light from the stained glass windows painted colored shapes on the stone floor. The vicar, a man named Reverend Thomas, met us in the aisle. He had been watching through the window. His eyes were red. He held both my hands and said, "Welcome, brother." And there, standing in the aisle of the church I had tried to shut down, surrounded by the very people I had turned away, I prayed the prayer that ended one life and began another. I said, "Jesus, I built a wall to keep you out, but you came through it like it was nothing. I have been wrong about you. I have hated your people. I have tried to silence your worship, but you came for me anyway. Forgive me. I know you are real. I surrender my whole life to you." What happened next changed everything. The congregation erupted in tears and embraces. People who had been kneeling on wet pavement minutes earlier were now celebrating. Margaret hugged me so tightly I felt her frail body shaking with joy. Over the following weeks, 14 of the 40 men gave their lives to Jesus. Tariq was the first. Bilal followed 3 days later. Imran took a month. Asif came last, quietly, sitting in the back of a Wednesday evening service and walking forward without anyone asking him to. I was baptized 2 months later at St. Matthew's. I chose the name Nathaniel because when Nathaniel first heard about Jesus, he asked, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And Philip answered with the only words that matter, "Come and see." The cost came swiftly. I told my father on a Tuesday evening in our front room. He was sitting in his chair by the window. I told him everything, the blockade, the old woman, the light, Jesus. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he stood. His face was the color of ash. His voice was shaking, but not with sadness, with rage held on the thinnest leash. "You are no longer my son," he said. "You are dead to us. Leave this house." My mother was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had heard everything. She cried like I had actually died. She said, "How could you do this to us?" and turned away. Sana came to my flat the next evening. She placed the engagement ring on the table and said one word, "Apostate." Then she left. The mosque community held a janaza prayer for me that Friday. Death threats arrived within the week. I was followed twice on my way to work. My employer received phone calls demanding I be fired. I eventually had to relocate to another city in England, where a church community helped me start again. I arrived with 2 bags and a Bible that Margaret had given me. That is when it happened once more. Not a vision, a peace so complete that it filled every empty room the losses had created. I had lost my family, my fiancé, my community, my reputation. But I gained everything that truly matters. Jesus, forgiveness, peace that could hold the weight of exile without cracking, and a purpose that makes every sacrifice feel small. It was in that new city that I met Hannah. She was a British Pakistani Christian woman who had come to faith as a teenager and been disowned by her own family. She understood every scar I carried because she carried her own. I told her everything. She listened with dry eyes and a steady heart. We were married 5 months later at St. Matthew's in Bradford. Reverend Thomas officiated. Tariq, Bilal, Imran, and Asif stood beside me in suits they bought with their first Christian paychecks. Margaret sat in the front row. She was 83 years old. She held her worn Bible in her lap and wept through the entire ceremony. Today, I work in ministry reaching Muslims across the United Kingdom with the gospel. I travel to mosques, community centers, and living rooms sharing my testimony. Over 100 Muslims have given their lives to Jesus after hearing my story. I returned to St. Matthew's last month and stood at the red doors where 40 men once formed a wall. I placed my hand on the wood and whispered thank you to the God who never needed a door to reach me. I still write letters to my parents twice a year. I tell them I love them. I tell them about Hannah and about our son Adam, whose morning prayer is, Jesus, thank you for knocking down walls. No response from my father. But my mother sent a short message through my aunt last Ramadan. It said, I have been praying. I do not know to whom anymore. I hold those 10 words closer than anything I own. Ask yourself this question. What wall have you built between yourself and God, and how much longer do you think it will hold? The Muslim man who organized 40 men to block the doors of a church no longer exists. In his place stands a follower of Jesus Christ who now opens those same doors every Sunday and welcomes every person who walks through them. If he can transform someone like me, someone who built a human wall to shut God out and watched God walk through it without even slowing down, then he can absolutely transform you. Jesus is calling you right now. Will you let him in? Or will you keep standing in a chain that was never strong enough to hold him back?